For that all too kind introduction. I could talk forever, and I won't though. At some point I'm going to quit and we'll take your questions and your comments. I'd like to introduce you to Jan Bissett, who is our law librarian. Jan makes all of this possible. Anytime I need data, and as frequently that I do, she collects it for me. I just say, get me this, get me that, and all of the data that I've used in connection with the election is due to her. And when we get back, I have other things I want her to collect and so forth. It's been a great relationship. Here is our Constitution. It's not very long. This is about it. And the important thing to understand is that it is an 18th century Constitution embodying 18th century notions of separation of powers and checks and balances. Everything we see happening today in Congress and with the President, whether it's elections, whether it's the working of the Congress, will trace itself to some provision in this Constitution. The framers came from the states. Remember that the American constitutional system begins with the states. The first constitutional document is the Declaration of Independence, and in American constitutional theory, all the power formerly exercised by the British Crown over domestic matters devolved on each of the states upon independence. The states are sovereign. State sovereignty is a given in the American constitutional system. When the framers convened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1987, they were first and foremost people from the states. They knew they needed something. You know, the original purpose was to consider amendments to the Articles of Confederation. They scrapped it and came up with the Constitution. But they were very concerned about this new federal government. They didn't want it to encroach on state power. Now you have to have federal supremacy if you're going to have a federal government, but they wanted to limit the power of Congress very significantly. First, they did it by saying Congress has only those enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. Now, the Supreme Court has interpreted that very, very broadly to keep up with modern times. But what hasn't changed is the structure. Once they agreed with a great compromise to have a House of Representatives representing the people according to respective numbers and a Senate representing each state, they insisted that the two bodies were going to have to coordinate. But think of this. Wyoming has one representative. Each state gets at least one. But it has two senators, the same as California, even though it only has 500,000 people compared to California's 37 million. That may seem very, very strange, but that is our system. And whenever I'm asked questions about this, about that, I can only say, this is our system. It's not going to change, and we have to operate within that framework. They didn't contemplate political parties. They called them factions, and we weren't going to have that. They assumed that all of the people in Congress who would be elected and in the Senate who were appointed by state governments, state legislatures prior to 1913 would be aristocratic public servants like themselves. They did not think we were going to have political parties, even though they arose soon after the 1796 election. So, you have to have consensus. The only way to get consensus is a compromise. And that's exactly what they anticipated, that the House and the Senate would compromise. That wasn't enough for the framers. They wanted the president to be a part of the electoral process. Naturally, they were thinking about George Washington, but you can see how difficult it is to enact laws even in the best of times. They didn't contemplate political parties. So what we see happening today is an 18th century Constitution based on consensus and compromise that did not contemplate political parties, let alone factions within a political party. How are we going to select those people in the House of Representatives? Well, of course, it was up to the states. The states set the qualifications for voters, and you may notice that some states have been changing election laws with things like voter ID and shorter periods to vote by mail and so forth, which on one side is said to be voter suppression, on the other is we just want to have purity of elections. But the states have the power to do it. More significantly, now the feds can intervene. They did this with the Voting Rights Act, but the Supreme Court said that a provision of that requiring pre-clearance was unconstitutional as intruding on the power of the states because it was based on 1965 data showing voting discrimination. Basically, the court says, if you're going to make the states submit their voting changes for pre-clearance, you have to use current data to show that there is still a problem of racial discrimination in the states where admittedly there was. So then the redistricting. In the 2010 election, the Republicans made enormous gains. Not only in the House of Representatives, but they made gains in the state legislatures. And by the way, the legislatures are as polarized as everything else. 27 state legislatures have the Republicans in control of both houses and a Republican governor. There are 17 states with a Democrats in control of both houses and a Democratic governor. There are only 5 states where control is divided. Nebraska has a unicameral, nonpartisan legislature. Okay, the Republicans make big gains in the state legislatures in the 2010 elections. The census data comes out in 2011, and the state legislatures are redrawing the districts for the 212 congressional districts, races, and through the decade until the next census. Given the Republican control of the 27 states, it should not be surprising that with today's computers, and you can get all the relevant data when you're trying to draw districts. The districts are heavily drawn in Republican states dominated by the Republicans to favor Republicans, and in the states dominated by the Democrats to favor the Democrats. For example, I will explain that Michigan is what we call a blue state, based on how it votes in presidential elections. The electorate is very different in the off-year elections. It's much smaller. The groups least likely to vote would be minorities and younger people who in presidential years vote Democratic. So, what do you have in Michigan? You have the Republicans controlling both houses of the legislature and the governorship. Of the 14 seats, Michigan constantly loses seats because it lost 1 seat in the last election. They can only seat 435 people in the South, in the House. So with every election, they reallocate seats based on population. The big gains are in the South and Southwest, Texas, Florida. The losses are in the older industrial states in the Midwest and the East, like Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, and so forth. In any event, the Republicans redistricted so that of the 14 seats, 9 of them are pretty reliably Republican, 5 are pretty reliably Democrat. The first district, which covers the Upper Peninsula in northern Michigan, is closer. Perhaps that could be a Democratic win, but not too likely. In any event, the Democrat, had a big sweep of the presidential race, but they only picked up 8 seats in the House. In order for the Democrats to get a majority in the House, they would need to win 17 seats in the 2014 election. Highly unlikely. So in all likelihood, no matter what happens in the House races, a few more here, a few more there, it's going to be a Republican-dominated House. What the framers feared of factions is now internally in the Republican Party because of the Tea Party faction. Republican members of Congress who are in safe Republican seats have more to fear from a primary challenge by a Tea Party-backed candidate than they do from a Democratic opponent. And so they are not responsive to issues like immigration. In most of these districts, there is a relatively limited, small or none Hispanic population. Their constituents say, we don't want any amnesty, keep them out, etc., etc. You know, we have no notion of the national interest. What the national interest is the interest of 435 congressional districts and 50 states as it plays out in Congress. So that's what the national interest means. Now, the Senate was very different. Senators are elected statewide. This is a greater opportunity for the Democrats in Michigan to elect 2 senators as they have done. Republicans have elected senators in blue states, especially in the 2010 election. I'm thinking of Pennsylvania and Illinois, to use 2 examples. 1/3 of the Senate seats come up every year. In the 2014 election, 23 Democrat seats come up, and so 23, and there'll be 10, 11, no, 20 and 13. I'm sorry, 20 and 13. Now, Democrats can get elected in red states, just as Republicans can elect it in blue states. Seats that are held by Democrats are coming up in red states. Montana, where Baucus, I think, is retiring. Alaska, where Begich is running for re-election, having barely squeaked by with Ted Stevens, who got a bad federal charge against him. North Carolina, a swing state. South Dakota, Tim Johnson has retired. That's very likely to be a Republican pickup. Louisiana, Mary Landrieu's running for re-election. Arkansas, Pryor. West Virginia, Rockefeller has retired. West Virginia had once been a Democratic state, but I think because of issues of the environment and coal, it's become a red state in presidential elections. So I've got 3, 4, I've made 7 seats. Michigan is coming, at least has a competitive race because Carl Levin isn't running. The Republicans need to win 6 seats. There are no Republican seats that are really in danger from a Democratic candidate. It is possible that the Republicans could take the Senate. Whichever party controls one house, they can do an awful lot. If you notice, the Republicans are having investigations. Today, there are 3 committee hearings on the Affordable Care Act. They will probably not stop having hearings on Benghazi through 2016 if Hillary Clinton runs for the president. Under the Constitution, each house sets its own rules. The Senate had a rule of unlimited debate. Senators are powerful. You know, it's only 100 of them as compared to 435 representatives. So someone like Peters would say, you know, I'm willing to give up my safe House seat in order to have a chance at being a senator. In any event, the Senate had a rule of unlimited debate. It took 60 votes to close off debate. Well, Democrats got tired of Republicans blocking presidential appointments and judicial nominees, and they used the nuclear option, which the Republicans had come up with when Democrats were doing this to Bush judicial nominees, by a procedure, by an invocation of a procedural rule. They changed the rule, and it didn't take 60 votes to change it. Rather, it is the Speaker rule. The Vice President presides, but he never does unless they need his vote. But it's a senior senator who says the rule, I rule now that it only takes a majority to confirm a judicial nominee, except for the Supreme Court, and presidential nominees. Republicans object to it. You appeal the ruling of the chair. Simple majority upholds the rule. So now the Obama's nominees to federal courts of appeal, federal district courts, and federal offices will get confirmed by the Senate. Watch them do it very hurriedly to try to get all of it done just in case they lose the Senate the next time around. If this seems to you dysfunctional, as it does to academics, my answer is, this is our system, this is the way it works. Now let me say something about the presidential election. As you know, we do not vote for the president. The so-called popular vote is not a vote for the president. It's not like they do in France, where on one Sunday you vote for a candidate, the next Sunday, if nobody gets 50% plus one, the next Sunday you vote for the two highest. So the French voters elect their president. Framers wouldn't do that. So the power given to the American president is enormous. In fact, I think, Walter, next year I'll do a presentation on the Constitution and the presidency. It would take us a long time to go through all the powers that the president had. In the view of the framers, the president was going to perform the function that in Great Britain was performed by the monarch and the prime minister. And the Constitution simply provides the executive power of the United States is vested in the President of the United States of America. That's incredible power. Although I used to say that the American president had the most power of anyone. That was before I went to Russia and gave some lectures there on American constitutional law. The Russian president, this is constitutionally, apart from all the other things he does, can issue decrees that have the force of law. And so if they are not overturned by the Duma, that's legislation in the Russian Federation. We gave the president a lot of power, but not that much. In any event, the framers knew who the first president was going to be. That was George Washington. Who was going to be the second president? That's where they got concerned. Remember, these are aristocrats. They don't have a lot of confidence in, quote, the people. Even though the only people who could vote would be white male property owners. But, you know, there were farmers, there were artisans, there were small businessmen. They couldn't be trusted with such an important task of electing the president. But the framers had to give some being to representative democracy. So they came up with this idea of the Electoral College. The people, quote, such as they were in 1787, would select electors in each state. These would be wise men who would convene in the state capital and say, well, I think John Adams would be a good president, I think Alexander Hamilton would be a good president, and so forth. They would cast their votes. The votes got sent to Washington. They're opened up in a joint session. And if nobody gets a majority on the first ballot, it's in the House of Representatives. That happened once in, I think it was 1824, how John Quincy Adams got elected. No one would ever know what you do with that. There was some concern in the 92 election, would Ross Perot get any electoral votes? He didn't. I guess the last time that somebody carried a stake was George Wallace in the 1968 elections. Anyhow, don't have to worry about that. So, we elect our president indirectly. The so-called popular vote is simply the total of people who voted for one candidate or another in the states. You could have a very different result if we had direct election of the president. There are Democratic voters in Texas who figure, why bother to vote? No way we can win. We do this in all the clear red states. Republicans in California and New York might say the same thing. The Electoral College is here to stay. Everybody likes it, except academics who periodically come up with proposals to change it. The big states like California like it because they have enormous influence. Small states like Wyoming like it because with their 3 electoral votes, they're at least a blip on the electoral map. By the way, think what the campaigns would be like if we had direct election of the president. I mean, they would be in New York and California and Texas all the time instead of in the so-called battleground states. The political parties are organized in each state. See, one of the reasons why a third party never gets anywhere is that they can field a presidential candidate, but they can't field candidates for Congress, for the Senate, for all the local offices. Each party has an organization in every state. They contest the elections even though they know they're going to lose them. And always have. This is the way, again, our two-party system operates. So the parties want the electoral system. The big states want it. The small states, it's here to stay. And you hear, well, the popular, about the election in 2002, Gore won the popular vote. No, all that means is that more people voting for electors voted for electors pledged to Gore than electors pledged to Bush. In the 2004 election, George Bush won by about close to 3 million votes. If Kerry had carried Ohio, Kerry would have been the president. But again had and if you may remember, the Republicans would always attack Clinton as a minority president because he got only a minority of the popular vote. That, of course, is nonsense. The only thing that counts is a majority of the electoral votes. Now, I was preparing that my basic talk was for a presentation for the Phi Beta Kappa alumni group, and I had to do it in October before the election, so I had to prepare alternative versions. Being a strong Obama supporter and a partisan Democrat, that gave me some pause, but not too much, because I read the electoral map. The electoral map favors the Democrats. California, there's one big red state, which is California. New York, which is Texas. New York, California, the New England states, Pennsylvania, all are blue states. Plus you're on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon. Remember, they were fighting over 4 states, North Carolina, Virginia, Ohio, and Florida. Romney only won North Carolina. What if Romney had won Florida, Ohio, and Virginia? That would have given him 60 votes. He still would have lost. He had 206 votes. You add 60 to it, you get 266. Obama had 272. The electoral map is formidable for the Republicans. What Republicans have going for them, however, is history. In more recent times, after one president has been elected for 2 terms, the president has been succeeded by a president of the other party. 2 terms for Clinton, 2 terms for George W. Bush, 2 terms for Obama. It is the Republicans' turn. They need a candidate who can win Virginia, Florida, Ohio, and North Carolina and pick up 1 or more of the blue states. Someone like Chris Christie might do that. Perhaps Jeb Bush could do that. We all know that the big issue in the 2016 election is, will Hillary run? I'm going to conclude by giving you some data about who voted for whom. Women outvoted men in the election by something like 53 to 47. Women voted for Obama 54%. Men voted for Romney at 53%. There is a clear gender gap when it comes to voting for candidates. The parties, and when you break it down further, the Democrats do very well among single women, lower income women, women of color, women who are most likely, most concerned about issues of reproductive freedom. And this is a problem for the Republicans because the Republican base is strongly pro-life. Nobody is going to win the Republican nomination unless that person is pro-life. But as the person does anti-abortion talk, that creates a problem with women. Whites voted for Romney 59% to 39% to Obama. The Republicans do very well among white voters, and 72% of the electorate is white. But of course, when it comes to minorities, African Americans like 90-some%, Hispanic Americans in the 70%, Asian Americans in the 70%, which would say it's of great interest, that it's in the interest of the Republican Party to support immigration reform. But that is not what the constituents of the Republicans in the House want. And that is why you're not going to get any kind of major immigration reform through the House. I've been talking for a good while, and left to my own devices, I would continue. I have a lot more data, but even I get tired of hearing myself talk. So I think it might be a good time for this group to weigh in with your questions and your comments, and then we would do the rest of the time interactive. Yes.
I'm sorry. I work here. I usually don't even ask questions during these brown bags, but I was listening. This is fascinating. What you were saying about the Latino vote. I recently listened on NPR, like maybe in the summer before school started, that I think is it Puerto Rico or Costa Rica, one of those commonwealths are thinking about statehood or whatever. I think it's
Puerto Rico.
Yeah, Puerto Rico, right? And there was an argument presented that because there's this thing with immigration, that the Republicans are not trying to have this extra contingency to consider if they become a state.
One of the arguments against, one of the reasons why Puerto Rico has a very special status. It is called a commonwealth. Puerto Ricans are citizens of the United States. They cannot vote for president because citizens don't vote for president. They vote for electors, and all of the electors come from the states. Yeah. A constitutional amendment was necessary to give residents of the District of Columbia 3 electoral votes. There's a lot of debate within Puerto Rico about, do we want statehood? It creates a lot of obligations as well. In any event, it's not going to happen because, as you say, the Puerto Rican will vote Democratic, and that's Republicans will not go along with that. Yeah.
I have a question. Your discussion about what the change in the Senate rule made me think about how that kind of makes, because we're becoming a much older country, if that makes us more kind of like a parliamentary system, like in Canada, where they just sort of do things, the parliament does things different than we do. Does that make us more like a parliament?
No. You cannot compare. In a parliamentary system, there is one source of power, and that is Parliament. If you ever watch Canadian Returns on the CBC, which we can get, they never talk about popular vote. They talk about ridings. The PCs are winning this riding, the Liberals are winning this riding, because all that counts is the number of seats in Parliament. And then they elect a prime minister who does not have executive power. He carries out the laws of Parliament, but is responsible to Parliament. And if the prime minister loses the majority, then they have to call another election. So no, you cannot compare any parliament. Our system is in no way like a parliamentary system. We call it a presidential system because of the president and the powers of Congress, but it should be better be called a divided system where, and it's not, as I said, even Congress, you have two houses. So no, I don't think there's any comparison at all.
I wonder if you have a conjecture about the possibility of changes that have been talked about in the way electors are voted in some states. That is, for example, if electors in Michigan were determined by congressional district, the Republicans have 9 versus 5, whereas by popular vote, the Democrats frequently win. And my understanding is that if that system were in place in the states now controlled by Republicans, Obama actually would have lost the last election in spite of a 5 million vote plurality.
There are two states, Maine and Nebraska, that allocate their votes by congressional district. I think Maine has 4 votes and Nebraska has 5. When this was proposed by some Republicans, other Republicans said, wait a minute, if we did that, Michigan would no longer be important. In other words, the only reason that Michigan is important as a battleground state is that it would have 16 electoral votes. If it would divide the votes up 9 to 5 or 10 to 6, it's not a very important state anymore. The proposal went nowhere. That's the answer. Again, the states are very, and the parties are very accustomed to operating within the system. And so they're just not going to, and again, you'd have different kinds of politicking if it went that way. In any event, forget it. It is winner take all, except in Nebraska and Maine. One of the congressional districts in Nebraska, near Omaha, voted for Obama in 2008. The Republican redistricting changed that district. Remember that electorates are very different, as I said before, in off-year elections. People who are more likely to vote in Democratic election in presidential years, young people and minorities, are less likely to vote in off years. Incidentally, there is one other statistic that I want to give you, which if I ever find it, and that is Obama's vote total. In 2008, I'm going from memory, can't correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2008, Obama got something like 69 million votes. Romney got 59 million. In 2012, Obama got 62,000 votes, and Romney got the same 59 million that McCain had gotten. In other words, there were something like 7 million people who voted for Obama in 2008 who apparently didn't vote in 2012, which I think is interesting. I also think, since we're speculating, that if Hillary does run, things are going to be turned around. You're going to find, I think, a number of women who are going to vote for Hillary, who otherwise would vote Republican or wouldn't vote at all, but are going to come out and vote for Hillary. I think those of you who had some experience in what we call gender politics understand that. Go ahead, next. Yes.
Me?
Yeah.
You brought up the Tea Party as being like possibly a serious challenge to a Republican candidate.
Yes.
So, what would you see as the possibility of like other third parties such as Libertarians, Green Party, that will possibly become more powerful proportion to the normal parties?
They don't last.
They won't?
They don't last. Who was the largest, what third party candidate got the most votes? That was Ralph Nader, running in 2000 and 2000. Clearly, it's believed that Nader made a difference. When he ran in 2004, he wasn't a serious candidate anymore. Same thing with Perot when he ran in 96. This is a one-time thing. We're not going to have a third party. Don't even think about it in your analysis. You can get a third party for a presidential election. Then it disappears. And it can't keep up the momentum until the next presidential election. You know, we've had 29 presidential elections since 1900. The Republicans have won 15, the Democrats have won 14. And I've been told by those who study the popular vote that it's been pretty even over the century as well. We're a two-party system. Third parties can emerge in a presidential race, but not otherwise. That's been our history and our experience. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to know what changes, if any, you would recommend to open up the system, democratize the system for participation and inclusion, because you emphasize that we have an 18th century system and the vast majority of the population was locked out of participation in the creation of that system. And so I asked the question on your recommendation because you seem to be pretty hard line. The system is here, it's going to stay.
That comes with old age. I mean, very seriously, one of the things that's come with old age is that you've seen it all, and it doesn't work. There have been proposals, for example, proposed that you allocate representation by interest groups. The minorities would have a certain percentage and the like. It doesn't happen. You couldn't do any of it without a constitutional amendment. By the way, the framers were incredible egotists. They figured we have the perfect system, and they made it so difficult to amend. You need 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states. Interesting question. Ask my students. The Supreme Court held in 1989 that the First Amendment protected flag burning. And I mean, there was an uproar, and there was a proposed constitutional amendment to allow the government to prohibit flag burning. You would think, why wouldn't that pass? The answer is, it couldn't get the 2/3 vote in the Senate. See, if you're in politics, anytime there's a vote, you have to think about how your vote could be used by your opponent in the next election. If you're a member of the House and you run every 2 years, that's going to be fresh. So if you're a member of the House, you're not going to vote against an amendment that would protect the American flag. How about senators? Well, when this came up, I think it was last 2006, Debbie Stabenow was running. Now, she didn't know that she was going to win by 16 percentage points. And a group of law professors sent her a letter saying, please oppose the amendment. And she came back and basically said, I support the amendment. She might not have done it if she would have known that she was going to win by 16%. But she was concerned. That's one vote. What about Michigan's other vote? Well, that's Carl Levin. Republicans never ran a serious race against Levin, so he can vote against the amendment. There were enough people in the Senate holding pretty safe seats who would oppose the amendment on principle that it could never get the 2/3 vote in the Senate. So it's extremely difficult to amend the Constitution unless there is a big, big consensus toward amending it. So I basically, the question that you raise is a very important one. The main way that we bring about change is through voting, through an electorate. Now, one of the things that is happening, the electorate is changing. The white percentage of the vote went from 78% to 72%. Minority is up to 28%. As a nation, we know the demographic change. We're going to be less and less. It still will always be a majority white nation, but we have an increasing number of minorities, mostly Hispanic. Hispanic women continue to have babies, which is less true of white women and less true now of African American women. The demographics show that, and Asians are coming in through immigration. So when you put together Hispanic, Asian, and African American, you have a pretty heavy voting bloc, which is why in states that the Republicans control, they're trying to keep down the minority vote because that vote is likely to stay Democratic. And incidentally, a thing about the Hispanic vote, when we talk about the Hispanic population, we're really talking about different people. We're talking about Puerto Ricans who are citizens. We're talking about Mexican American, which is the largest proportion. We're talking about other Latin American, and we're talking about Cubans. The Cubans are different. I mean, they have mostly, they come in, so, they came in traditionally as refugee status. They were very conservative. The first generation voted Republican. Ted Cruz is a good example of the Cuban vote. Second generation, not so clear. But basically, you see this demographic change. On a local basis, you see the demographic change in Oakland County. Oakland County, when we came here, was virtually all white except for some areas in Southfield where we live in Pontiac. More and more African American families have moved to Oakland County. That has a lot to do with the decline in Detroit's population. Asian American families live in Oakland County, with the end result that the Republicans, the Democrats carry Oakland County in statewide elections. They won the prosecutor and the county clerk. I think when Brooks Patterson retires, they'll elect the county executive. Demographics make a big difference. We are polarized in many ways. The typical Republican, if you want to do a caricature of the Republican voter, it is an older white male. If you want to do a caricature of the Democratic vote, and higher income. If you want to do a caricature of the Democratic voter, it is a woman of color, lower income. Their figures broke down on race. On income. Under 50,000 Democratic, over 50,000 Republican. I mean, these are, in fact, there's a figure on that. Like Obama got 60% of the under 50, 46% of 50 to 90, and 44% of 100 and over. Also age. The 18 to 29, Obama gets 60%. 30 to 44, 52. 65 and over, down to 44%. So, I mean, basically, Obama prevails in the under 44, and Romney, the 45 plus. I mean, these are things that are known. I mean, the parties have incredible organization, and with computers and the internet, voting is very different. The broad answer to your question is changes will come by increased voter participation. At some point, I don't know when, but at some point we're going to see comprehensive immigration reform. It will be at a time, maybe after the 2016 election. If the Democrats do a sweep, which is possible, they could get in the 2016 election, there are 24 Republican Senate seats coming up compared to 10. So the Democrats could get a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. Be interesting to see what they do in the House. From the standpoint of the Republicans, if they want to do anything, they need to elect a president. Had Romney been elected in 2012, even with the Democrats in the Senate, the Republicans might have been able to repeal or substantially modify Obamacare. Any efforts to touch Obamacare run into Obama, so it's not going to happen in the next 3 years. Yes?
This is a legal question. I'd like your opinion. My understanding is the Supreme Court has taken hands off on the gerrymandering of states
Yes.
and districts.
Yes.
Are there any restraints based on Supreme Court decisions that prevent the states from even further abuse of this process of who can vote and who can't?
If you draw districts on racial lines, clearly we have connected by this to benefit minorities or benefit whites, that would be unconstitutional. There are certain constraints under the Voting Rights Act, but you see, again, and this is interesting. If you're a Republican, you want to pack. I've done some voting rights litigation here over the years. You want to pack minorities. You want a district that is 100% minority. If you're a Democrat, you would like districts that are maybe 40% minority because you can spread it out. So you have that conflict, and I was involved in this in the early 80s when African Americans like Coleman Young wanted to have congressional districts with an effective black majority. And they were basically fighting the Democratic Party, which didn't care about majority black districts. They wanted majority Democratic districts. Finally, the Democrats conceded, and we had majority black districts. But when they now it's interesting when you start redistricting Michigan, you start with Detroit, and that would give you 2 districts with African American majorities. I think the district that Peters represents, even though he's white, does have an African American voting majority, and he will likely be succeeded by an African American, probably Rudy Hobbs or someone of those sort. But then that gives that complies with the Voting Rights Act. Then they try to make the rest of as many as they can, majority Republican. And the Democrats do the same thing in a state like Illinois, where they control both houses of the legislature and the governor's office.
What about voter suppression itself? What are the limitations there?
Again, where the Voting Rights Act preclearance was in effect, that was a way to check some of it. But see, the problem is a voter ID law is a neutral law, and it's a question of whether the state makes alternative ways of ID available. The truth is, it is debatable how much, I mean, when we put the rhetoric aside, it is debatable how much these laws actually keep down the minority vote. See, again, the problem with trying to measure the minority vote is it is very different in presidential years than in off years. Yes, you have a question here.
Yep, very quickly. I'd just like to know, although redistricting has favored the Republican Party
In Michigan.
in Michigan
And nationwide.
and nationwide, do you think the government shutdown will affect any of the election in 2014?
No, because it happened a while ago. But your question is interesting. The Republicans have a pretty safe majority, unless a tsunami would hit. Now, the Republicans took a big hit, attitude-wise, let's say, based on the closure. They would take a very big hit if the debt limit were not raised. Boehner knows that. And on those issues, the Heistert rule, named after the Speaker of the House, Dennis Heistert, is we Republicans will not bring a bill to the floor unless it has some support of a majority of Republicans. But when it came to reopening the government, they did that, saying that they will not allow the debt limit to, they will not allow the United States to default. Then you can say, well, is Obama hurt by the Affordable Care Act? Well, this is going to be a very interesting political thing. 2014 election. By that time, we will see how successful the act has been. We will also see whether the economy keeps going. If you're a Democrat running for the House, I think you have to support the Affordable Care Act. You have all the good things it does. You can keep your insurance, no limits. You keep your kids on it. I mean, they can't. And it'll be interesting to see if the Republicans think that they have some advantage. Now, this may be changed state by state, but they say, well, is Obama weakened? What does that mean? He's not running for re-election. He has the power to veto anything. It's the Republicans, when they negotiate back and forth, Obama, in a way, has the upper hand because the Republicans, I think, won't do another shutdown. If you don't do another shutdown, you eventually have to compromise. But then, of course, hopefully both sides do compromise. And that's the point on which our system depends on compromise and consensus. And the reason we don't see bills coming out of Congress is you can't get consensus because you can't get compromise. And that is our system. In order to understand all that, we have to understand our 18th century Constitution. Yes?
Isn't that the difficulty though with the Tea Party is that they supposedly don't want to compromise either within the Republican Party, that they're kind of ideological purists?
They are. And there are 5 Senate seats that might be Republican, but for the Tea Party. For example, Olympia Snowe chose not to run in Maine. Angus King has it. He caucused with the Democrats. Harry Reid was in trouble supposedly in Nevada until the Republicans nominated Sharon Angle. Delaware had an open seat, and Mike Castle, who was their only member of Congress, a moderate Republican, he would have won big. O'Donnell knocked him off in a primary. Lugar would be basically unopposed in Cincinnati. I can't remember the name of the person who who beat him in the primary. He was an expert on women's pregnancy and rape, which helped. McCaskill was in trouble in Missouri. Again, a Tea Party type candidate. So you can think about that. Thanks to if it weren't for the Tea Party, the Republicans might have 5 more seats. The business interests are now trying to raise money to support opponents for Tea Party candidates in primaries. For example, Kentucky was where I came from. Mitch McConnell had been a student in my first class at the University of Kentucky back in '66. He would win re-election easily. He is being challenged in the Republican primary. I don't think he will lose, but this is something that the Republicans have to think about. This is why the gun control bill couldn't pass the Senate. The Republicans had to think about a Tea Party challenger in the primary. Well, yes, go ahead. I can go all day, go ahead.
What's the chance of the Republican Party just fracturing over these issues like immigration, female agency, on and on? You got the Tea Party, and they're sort of welcome but unwelcome in the Republican Party. Is there any chance of that happening?
No. That is to say, I mean, the two-party system is very strong. But keep an eye on for this. It has been, let's assume that you have Chris Christie or Jeb Bush running. Oh, they'll never make it through the Iowa caucuses. But what about the Republicans in bigger states, blue states, who have more delegates in the Republican convention, like New York and California? Maybe the Republicans are going to get the idea that we have to somehow get together and nominate a more moderate candidate, which is what the Democrats did when they came up with Bill Clinton. Remember, this was the New Democrat notion. Watch for some interesting battles within the Republican Party. But where the money is against the Tea Party. The Tea Party candidates have beaten well-financed Republican establishment candidates. But that's where the battle is, and I think a lot of it's going to play out in the 2016 presidential election. Watch to see who gets the Republican nomination. Thank you. It's been a great time. This is, yeah. This was, I was going to talk to you, which I haven't done yet.